The letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, nestled between a stack of utility bills and a coupon for a local pizza joint. The VYD Carter, a retired Marine with a no-nonsense demeanor, barely glanced at it as he carried his mail inside. He set his coffee cup on the kitchen counter and absent-mindedly flipped through the envelopes. That's when the bold red letters caught his attention. Violation notice, immediate action required. The VYD's eyebrows lifted slightly. This was new. Curious, he tore open the envelope and scanned the page until his eyes landed on the offense in question. His mouth curved into an incredulous smirk. A fine of due la $750. The reason? Unauthorized display of an outdoor flag. He blinked, then read it again. Surely, this had to be a mistake. The VYD turned his head toward the large bay window that overlooked his front yard. There, just as it had always been, stood his American flag, mounted on a pole attached to his porch. It waved gently in the morning breeze, untouched and unassuming. He had raised it years ago when he moved in, a simple symbol of his lifelong dedication to the country and its laws. And now, according to this absurd letter, it was a problem. The VYD let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. They really didn't know who they were dealing with. Folding the letter neatly, he placed it on the counter and grabbed his car keys. He had lived in this neighborhood for 8 years without issue, but he knew enough about the Homeowners Association, HOA, to be aware of their reputation petty, power-hungry, and notoriously unforgiving. The HOA board had been known to fine residents over trivial matters. An overgrown bush, a parked car slightly off-center, a garden gnome deemed too distracting. Nothing was safe from their scrutiny. Still, this was a new level of ridiculous. By the time the VYD arrived at the HOA office, the place was already buzzing with active VYT. A few residents sat in the waiting area, their faces a mix of frustration and resignation. It was clear he wasn't the only one dealing with their nonsense today. As he approached the receptionist's desk, a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes peered over her glasses. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone flat and disinterested. The VYD set the letter down on the counter. "I received this violation notice about my flag. I think there's been a mistake." The woman barely glanced at it before sighing. "There's no mistake, sir. The HOA has strict regulations regarding outdoor displays." "Outdoor displays?" The VYD repeated, feigning confusion. "You mean holiday decorations? Inflatable Santas? What exactly is the issue here?" "The issue," a voice interrupted from behind him, "is that all exterior decorations and displays must be pre-approved by the HOA board." The VYD turned to find himself face-to-face with Margaret Collins, the HOA president. He had seen her around a handful of times, always dressed impeccably, always exuding an air of self-importance. She was flanked by 2 other board members, both wearing identical expressions of smug authority. "I see," the VYD said, his voice calm. "So you're telling me that an American flag, a legally protected display under the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act, is somehow in violation of HOA rules?" Margaret's lips pursed, clearly irritated that he had come prepared. "The HOA has its own guidelines, Mr. Carter, and as a resident, you agreed to abide by them." The VYD leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "I also swore an oath to uphold the Constitution, and last I checked, federal law trumps HOA regulations." A flicker of uncertainty passed across Margaret's face, but it was gone in an instant. "We are simply enforcing community standards," she said. "If you refuse to remove the flag, further penalties will be applied." The VYD studied her for a long moment. He could see it now, the power trip, the need for control. She had no real authority, but she thrived on the illusion of it. It was almost amusing. "Almost." "Margaret," he said, his voice even, "you might want to reconsider." Her eyes narrowed. "And why is that?" The VYD smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Because you have no idea who you're trying to mess with." A tense silence settled over the room. A few residents in the waiting area had turned their heads, sensing the shift in energy. Margaret straightened her posture, clearly unwilling to back down. "The fine stands," she said firmly. "You have 7 days to comply." The VYD gave her a slow nod, pocketing the letter. "All right," he said, turning toward the exit. "Let's play this out." As he walked away, he could feel their eyes on him, could practically hear the gears turning in their heads. They thought they had won, that he would fold under their pressure like so many others before him. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly guess, was that the VYD Carter wasn't just another frustrated homeowner. He was a retired Marine with a deep understanding of the law and a network of influential friends. And they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Back at home, the VYD sat down in his study, flipping through legal texts with practiced ease. The case law was crystal clear. The HOA didn't stand a chance. Yet something told him Margaret wouldn't go down without a fight. That was fine. He was more than ready. Over the next few days, the letters continued to arrive, each one more aggressive than the last. The fines escalated. The threats of legal action became bolder. Neighbors began whispering, some urging him to comply, others silently rooting for him. A few even confessed they had been fined for equally ridiculous reasons, but had paid out of fear of retaliation. The pattern was OBVYS. This wasn't about rules or regulations. This was about control. Then came the real kick-her final notice delivered by hand, warning that if he did not comply, the HOA would escalate the matter to their legal team. The VYD laughed when he read it. They were actually going to take him to court. That evening, as he sat on his porch sipping his coffee, he watched the HOA members stroll through the neighborhood, issuing fines, checking homes, flexing their perceived authority. They still had no idea. The VYD reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a call. "Yeah, it's me," he said. "I need to prepare for a case. It's going to be an easy one, but it'll be entertaining." There was a pause on the other end before the person chuckled. "What are we dealing with?" The VYD glanced at the violation notice one last time before smirking. "An HOA board that thinks they can overrule federal law." The laughter on the other end was immediate. "All right," the voice said. "Let's have some fun with this." The VYD leaned back in his chair, watching as the flag outside his house waved proudly in the breeze. 7 days. That's how long Margaret and her little army had before they walked straight into the biggest legal humiliation of their lives. He couldn't wait. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Friday evening in a neighborhood clubhousey modest building that looked like it had once been an attempt at luxury, but had settled into mediocrity. The parking lot was already full when the VYD arrived. He could see clusters of residents gathered in small groups, some murmuring among themselves, others glancing toward the entrance with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The air was thick with anticipation, as though everyone knew something was about to happen but wasn't sure how it would unfold. The VYD stepped inside, immediately greeted by the sight of Margaret Collins standing at the front of the room, arms crossed, her expression one of smug confidence. The other HOA board members sat at a long table behind her, their faces blank but their postures rigid. A few of them looked like they weren't entirely comfortable with what was happening, but none of them were about to challenge Margaret. She ruled over the board with an iron grip, and they all knew it. The seating area was packed. Neighbors had come out in foursome, sitting with arms crossed in defiance, others simply there for the spectacle. It was rare for HOA meetings to be this full, but word had spread fast about the battle brewing between Margaret and the new troublemaker on the block. What many didn't realize was that they weren't just about to witness a simple disagreement over HOA rules. They were about to watch the downfall of the most power-hungry woman in the neighborhood. Margaret cleared her throat, drawing the room's attention. She tapped a stack of papers against the table, her lips pursed as she scanned the crowd. Finally, her gaze settled onto VYD, and a satisfied smirk played on her lips. "Before we begin with the regular agenda," she said, her voice carrying an air of forced politeness, "we need to address a violation that has recently come to our attention. Mr. Carter, please stand." The VYD remained seated for a moment, letting the tension build, before finally pushing himself to his feet. He met Margaret's gaze with calm indifference, his expression unreadable. Margaret turned to the crowd, gesturing toward him as if she were about to put on a grand performance. Mr. Carter has refused to comply with HOA regulations regarding unauthorized exterior decorations. Despite multiple warnings, he has failed to remove the offending display and has instead chosen to challenge the authority of this board. As such, we have no choice but to move forward with legal action. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some residents exchanged nervous glances, while others whispered to their neighbors. The VYD could see a few people nodding in agreement with Margaret, but there were just as many shaking their heads, clearly skeptical of the board's actions. The VYD clasped his hand behind his back, his voice steady as he finally spoke. "Margaret, are you absolutely sure you want to take this to court?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about what I want, Mr. Carter. It's about enforcing community standards." The VYD exhaled softly, shaking his head. "Interesting," he said, pulling a folded document from his pocket and holding it up. "Because according to federal law specifically, the freedom to display the American flag, no Homeowners Association can prohibit or restrict a resident from displaying the United States flag on their own property." A hush fell over the room. People shifted in their seats, eyes darting between the VYD and Margaret. Some leaned forward, clearly intrigued by the unfolding drama. Margaret let out a short, unimpressed laugh. "Mr. Carter, the HOA has its own guidelines. Those are the rules you agreed to when you moved in." The VYD smiled faintly. "And those guidelines don't override federal law. No HOA regulation does. I assume you've re-VYEU'd the legal precedents on this matter." Margaret's smirk faltered just for a second. She recovered quickly, but the VYD caught the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She hadn't done her homework. She had been so confident in her authority that she hadn't even considered the possibility that someone might challenge her with actual law. A few whispers started among the residents, some turning to each other in realization. One older man in the back raised a hand. "But you're saying the HOA has been fining people for things they legally can't enforce." Margaret's head snapped in his direction. "That's not what this is about," she said quickly, her voice sharper than before. The VYD raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it?" A woman near the front spoke up. "Wait a second, if they can't fine him for this, what about all the other fines people have been forced to pay?" The room was shifting. Margaret could feel it. The control she had wielded so effortlessly for years was slipping through her fingers, and it was happening right in front of her. She squared her shoulders, trying to regain her footing. "This is not up for debate," she said tightly. "The board has made its decision. Mr. Carter will either comply or face legal consequences." The VYD tilted his head slightly. "You sure about that?" He reached into his other pocket and pulled out another document, unfolding it with slow deliberation. "Because as of this afternoon, I've officially filed a case against this HOA for harassment, unlawful fines, and misuse of funds." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a few outright exclamations of disbelief filled the space. Margaret's face drained of color. "You what?" she sputtered. The VYD handed the document to the nearest resident, who immediately began reading it aloud. It outlined the legal violations committed by the HOA, the unlawful fines imposed, and the potential financial repercussions they now faced. More importantly, the VYD continued, his voice carrying easily over the noise. "This is not just about my flag. This is about every resident who has been bullied into paying fines they didn't actually owe." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. People started nodding, some even voicing their own grievances. "My son got fined for Leah VYing his bike in the driveway for 15 minutes. They made me repaint my house because they said the shade was too bright, but they changed the rule after I did it. They charged me for an unauthorized mailbox that was already there when I bought the house." The floodgates had opened. The meeting was no longer under Margaret's control. She slammed a hand against the table. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Mr. Carter is trying to turn this into a witch hunt." The VYD simply smiled. "No, Margaret. I'm just making sure people know their rights." A younger man near the back laughed, shaking his head. Wow, you really thought you could find a retired Marine and get away with it? The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's expression twisted in disbelief. What? The VYD met her gaze, his smile never wavering. Did I forget to mention that part? It was over. Everyone in the room knew it. The board members looked at each other, their confidence crumbling. Margaret was speechless, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that wouldn't come. The residents, on the other hand, erupted into cheers and laughter. The VYD turned toward the exit, pausing just long enough to deliver one final message. You have two choices, he said. Drop the fine and start refunding the money you stole from this community, or prepare to lose in court. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need to. Margaret Collins was not the type to admit defeat. Despite the absolute humiliation at the HOA meeting, she wasn't ready to let go of her power so easily. That much became evident when, 2 days later, the VYD received yet another notice from the HOA. This one wasn't just another fine. It was an official statement declaring that the matter was now in the hands of the HOA's legal team. They were moving forward with court proceedings. The VYD almost felt sorry for them. Almost. He sat in his study, reading over the letter with quiet amusement before dialing his attorney. The moment his friend, Mark Thompson, answered the phone, there was laughter on the other end. You weren't kidding, Mark said, chuckling. These people really think they can take you to court over this. The VYD smirked, leaning back in his chair. Margaret Collins thinks she's in V. Weinseibel. She's betting that no one in this neighborhood has the time or resources to challenge her authority. Well, she picked the wrong target. Mark replied, Do you want me to handle this? Or do you want the satisfaction of doing it yourself? I'll handle it, the VYD said. I want them to see just how badly they've miscalculated. Mark let out a whistle. This is going to be fun. The court date was set for the following week, but before that, something interesting happened. Rumors began circulating throughout the neighborhood. People were talking, whispering about money, specifically the HOA's money. It started with a few simple questions. Where was all the money from the years of fines collected? The HOA had charged outrageous fees for every minor infraction, but no one had ever seen a clear financial report. The clubhouse was in mediocre condition, the community pool needed repairs, and there were no Weinseibel improvements being made to the neighborhood. So where had all that money gone? One resident, a retired accountant named George, decided to dig deeper. Using some contacts at the county office, he managed to get a copy of the HOA's publicly filed financial records. What he found made his blood boil. At the next informal gathering of homeowners no longer under Margaret's control, George stood up with a folder in his hands and cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice tight with anger, I think we've been robbed. He laid out the facts. The HOA had been collecting thousands of dollars in fines every year, but a significant portion of those funds were unaccounted for. Large sums of money had been labeled as administrative costs, but there were no records of what those costs actually covered. More troubling, several payments had been made to a private account linked to none other than Margaret Collins herself. Outrage rippled through the crowd. People started shouting, demanding answers. She's been stealing from us. All those fines we paid, where did they go? The VYD listened from the back of the crowd, arms crossed, waiting for the INEVY table. Margaret had been so focused on her fight against him that she hadn't realized her own house of cards was collapsing. The day of the court hearing arrived. The VYD walked into the courtroom with complete confidence, his suit crisp, his demeanor calm. Margaret and her legal team sat at the opposite table, though she didn't look nearly as confident as she had at the HOA meeting. The moment she saw the VYD step forward, she stiffened. The judge entered, and the case began. The HOA's lawyer attempted to argue that the VYD had violated the association's regulations and that, as a resident, he was obligated to follow their rules. The VYD remained silent, waiting for his turn. When the judge finally looked at him, he spoke with the same level of patience he used when dealing with foolish arguments in his own courtroom. Your Honor, he said, placing the legal documents before the judge. As you can see, the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act explicitly states that a homeowners association cannot prohibit a resident from displaying the United States flag on their property. Furthermore, my flag meets all reasonable size and safety requirements, meaning there is no justification for this fine. The judge flipped through the paperwork, nodding as he read. The opposing lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The VYD continued. Additionally, I would like to bring to the court's attention a secondary matter. The HOA in question has been imposing fines that are not only unlawful, but appear to be part of a larger financial mismanagement issue. There is substantial evidence to suggest that the HOA's president, Margaret Collins, has been embezzling funds collected through these fines. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Margaret V.Y. Sibley paled. The judge's expression darkened. Mr. Carter, the judge said, do you have a VY Denke to support this claim? The VYD turned toward the door. I do, Your Honor. And so do the residents of my neighborhood. Right on cue, the doors opened, and a group of residents entered, led by George, who held a thick folder in his hands. He stepped forward, handing the financial records to the court clerk. The judge flipped through them, his frown deepening. He looked up, staring directly at Margaret. Miss Collins, he said, do you have an explanation for these discrepancies? Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it again. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead. The VYD folded his hands. It appears that while she was so focused on controlling her neighbors, she forgot that some of them might know how to follow a paper trail. The judge set the documents down. I'm ordering a full audit of the HOA's finances, he announced. If these allegations are true, there will be criminal charges. The courtroom erupted. Residents cheered. Margaret sank lower into her chair, her face drained of all color. The judge turned back to the original case. As for the matter of the flag fine, Mr. Carter is correct. The fine is illegal and is hereby dismissed. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to issue refunds to any resident who was charged for similar unjustified violations. Davui denoted. Thank you, Your Honor. The case was over, but Margaret's troubles were just beginning. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered. The news of the HOA scandal had spread fast, and cameras flashed as the VYD stepped out into the sunlight. How does it feel to take down a corrupt HOA? One journalist asked. The VYD gave a small smile. Justice has a way of catching up with people. Margaret Collins thought she was untouchable. She was wrong. Later that evening, the neighborhood was alive with celebration. People gathered outside their homes, chatting, laughing, sharing stories of their own frustrations with the HOA. A few residents even held up small American flags, while VYing them in quiet defiance. The VYD stood on his porch, watching the scene with satisfaction. He had never intended to become the face of an HOA rebellion, but if it meant his neighbors could finally live without fear of ridiculous fines, then it was worth it. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Mark. Nice work, Marine. Remind me never to get on your bad side. The VYD chuckled, typing back a simple response. Just follow the law, and we won't have a problem. As he slipped his phone back in his pocket, he looked up at his flag, still while VYing proudly in the night breeze. This time, there would be no more letters, no more threats, no more ridiculous fines. The HOA had tried to fight the law, and they had lost. The fallout from the court case was swift and brutal. By the next morning, news of the HOA's humiliation had spread throughout the neighborhood like wildfire. Residents who had once cowered in fear of Margaret Collins and her board now spoke freely, venting years of pent-up frustration. For the first time in a long time, people felt empowered to challenge the rules that had been unfairly imposed on them. And for Margaret, there was nowhere left to hide. A formal investigation into the HOA's finances was launched immediately. The court had ordered a third-party audit, and within days, the extent of the corruption became painfully clear. Margaret had been funneling funds into a private account for years, disguising the transactions under vague labels like administrative fees and community improvements that had never actually happened. The total amount stolen was staggering. Thousands upon thousands of dollars that should have gone to maintaining the neighborhood had instead lined Margaret's pockets. The news sent shockwaves through the HOA board. Some members, desperate to save themselves, turned against Margaret almost instantly. They claimed they had no idea what she had been doing, that she had kept them in the dark. But it was too late. The entire HOA had been complicit, whether actively or through their silence. By the end of the week, Margaret had resigned from her position as HOA president, though it wasn't exactly voluntary. The board held an emergency vote, and the decision to remove her was unanimous. As she walked out of the HOA office for the last time, she kept her head down, avoiding the stares and whispers of her former neighbors. She had once commanded fear and respect in the community, but now all she had was disgrace. But her problems didn't end there. The state attorney's office had been notified of the financial crimes, and soon enough, Margaret found herself facing charges for embezzlement, fraud, and financial misconduct. The thought of her sitting in a courtroom this time as a defendant rather than the one handing out punishments was a fitting end to her reign of terror. With Margaret gone, the neighborhood had a choice to make. The HOA, as it had existed, was no longer sustainable. The corruption had run too deep, and trust in the system had been completely eroded. Some residents wanted to dissolve the HOA entirely, while others argued that it could be reformed under better leadership. The VYD found himself at the center of these discussions not because he had sought out leadership, but because people trusted him. He had stood up to the corruption when no one else had dared to, and now they looked to him for guidance on what to do next. At a community meeting, people gathered to voice their thoughts. Some were still hesitant, worried that a new HOA would just fall back into the same cycle of abuse. Others were hopeful, believing that with the right people in charge, they could actually create a system that worked for everyone. The VYD listened patiently before finally speaking. He wasn't interested in controlling the neighborhood, but he knew one thing for certain. Things couldn't go back to the way they were. If an HOA was going to exist, it needed to be accountable, transparent, and fair. Together, the residents drafted new bylaws, stripping the HOA of the power to impose arbitrary fines. The new board, chosen through fair elections rather than backroom deals, was made up of people who genuinely wanted to serve the community rather than rule over it. And at the heart of it all was a new requirement. Any and all financial decisions had to be publicly documented and approved by majority vote. No more secret counts. No more unexplained expenses. The change was immediate. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the neighborhood for years finally lifted. People no longer worried about being fined for ridiculous reasons. Neighbors started talking to each other again, not in hushed whispers, but openly and without fear. For the first time in a long time, the community felt like a place where people actually wanted to live. And to VYD, he was more than happy to return to his normal life. One afternoon, as he was enjoying a cup of coffee on his porch, a familiar face walked up his driveway. It was George, the retired accountant who had played a huge role in exposing the HOA's corruption. You know, George said, sitting down on the porch steps, a lot of people wanted you to run for HOA president. Davou di laft. Not a chance. Didn't think so, George said, chuckling. But still, you did a hell of a thing, standing up to them. If you hadn't, who knows how much longer they would have gotten away with it. The VYD took a sip of his coffee, glancing at the American flag, still waving in the breeze. Some fights are worth waving, he said simply. George nodded in agreement, staring at the flag for a moment before shaking his head. You know, it's funny. They thought they could push you around. Didn't even know who they were messing with. Davou dismailed. They do now. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood underwent a quiet transformation. The tension that had once defined life under the old HOA gradually faded away. People started making small improvements to their homes without fear of being penalized for the tiniest infractions. The new board focused on practical matters, maintaining the roads, ensuring security, organizing community events rather than micromanaging people's personal lives. One of the most satisfying moments came when the first refunds were issued. Every resident who had been unfairly fined received a check in a Mila tangible reminder that the era of unchecked HOA power was over. It was a small VY Tory in the grand scheme of things, but to the people who had been bullied and extorted for years, it meant everything. As for Margaret, she disappeared from the neighborhood entirely. Her house was put up for sale, though it took months for anyone to buy it. No one wanted to live in the former dictator's house. Eventually, she left town altogether, her reputation in ruins, her legacy nothing more than a cautionary tale. The story of the HOA's downfall spread beyond the neighborhood, even making its way to local news outlets. People across the country, sick of their own HOA horror stories, celebrated what had happened. The VYD received countless messages from strangers, some congratulating him, others sharing their own battles with overreaching homeowners associations. Some even asked for legal ad VYC. He had to politely decline. He had no interest in making a career out of fighting HOAs, but he couldn't help but smile at the irony of it all. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the VYD stood outside his house, watching the flag he had fought to keep. It had never been about the flag itself. It had been about something bigger, about standing up for what was right, about reminding people that just because someone has authority doesn't mean they have the right to abuse it. A car drove past, and a neighbor waved from the driver's seat. The VYD waved back, feeling for the first time in a long time that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The battle was over. Justice had been served, and the neighborhood, at last, was free. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this VY with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next VY.